people, and Esther was the main one that shaped the nation. And key words are humility and interdependence. Dependence with one another in the same agreement, but not independently with just one person. And we'll see as a personal application, as I go to the end, as we draw to the end, we'll see how the book of Esther can be applied to our lives in this very day and moment. King Ahasuerus reigned over 127 provinces from India to Ethiopia. The king was preparing to go to war with Greece and held a lavish banquet that was for men only, and it lasted for 6 months. He was hoping to raise support of the Persian leaders to support him in his attempts to conquer the Greeks. Simultaneously, Queen Vashti held a banquet that was for women only. On the 7th day, when the heart of the king was merry with wine, he commanded 7 eunuchs who served in the presence of King Ahasuerus to bring Queen Vashti before the king, wearing her royal crown, in order to show her beauty to the people and the officials, for she was beautiful to behold. But Queen Vashti refused to come at the king's command. Therefore, the king was furious, and his anger burned within him. This led to a discussion among King Ahasuerus and his wise men who knew the law and the times with the queen. What shall we do with Queen Vashti according to law, because she did not obey the command of King Ahasuerus? Memucan, one of the king's wise counsel, answered, Queen Vashti has not only wronged the king, but also all the princes and all the people who are in all the provinces of King Ahasuerus. The consensus amongst them was that this response by Queen Vashti would have influence over all the wives of the princes who governed over the territories that were provinces governed by King Ahasuerus. They didn't have a law about Queen Vashti's behavior of refusal of the command of the king, so they had to make up one. In answer to the question as to what to do then with Queen Vashti, Memucan says in chapter 1, verse 19, if it pleases the king, let a royal decree go out from him, and let it be recorded in the laws of the Persians and the Medes, so that it will not be altered, that Vashti shall come to no more before the king, and let the king give her royal position to another who is better than she. The king thought that sounded like a good plan, so he agreed with Memucan's suggestion, and letters were sent out to all the king's provinces that each man should be the master of his own household. Following this came a suggestion from the king's servants who attended him. Chapter 2, verse 3 and 4. Let beautiful young virgins be sought for the king. Let them be brought to Shushan, the citadel, into the women's quarters, and beauty preparations be given them. Then let the young woman who pleases the king be queen instead of Vashti. This pleased the king, and he did so. In Shushan, the citadel, there was a certain Jew named Mordecai, adopted his orphaned cousin named Hadassah. This was Esther's Hebrew name, which means myrtle, referring to the well-known and beautiful evergreen shrub. She reflected the myrtle in her courage and obedience, which clearly did not wither, even when she faced death. Esther became her Persian name, which means star. Again, her beauty, her grace and character shone bright and unwavering against the darkness threatening the Jews. Esther was one of the beautiful young women brought to Shushan, the citadel, under the custody of Haggai, the custodian of all these women. Esther pleased Haggai and obtained favor with him, and so he readily gave beauty preparations to her, besides her allowance. She was granted 7 maidservants from the king's palace, and Haggai moved Esther and her maidservants to the best place in the house of the women. That's favor. It's real favor. So as I go along, I'm going to have little lessons to point out kind of what we're talking about. So in this lesson, I'm asking, so how do you find favor with others? And I would take Esther's, how she handled favor with Haggai, because she was always kind, she was always very respectful, and she was always very honoring. And of course, all of those characteristics please God. Each young woman was given 12 months of beauty preparations before being able to see the king. 6 months with oil of myrrh, and 6 months perfumes and preparations for beautifying women. I can't imagine that length of time for beautifying, but what luxury, huh? So finally, after being prepared according to the regulations, each woman could choose whatever they wanted from the women's quarters to take with her to the king's palace. Esther, however, requested nothing except what Haggai advised. So I'm pointing out another little lesson here, that she chose wisdom. Esther could have had anything to put on and dress and have before the king, but she knew that it was probably better to take advice from Haggai about what to wear, what to choose, because Haggai knew the king much better than she. And so she chose wisdom and just chose to take his advice. And so we can see here that Esther was not thinking of her own desires. And therefore, if we are not educated on a decision that we have to make, putting it into our own lives, and so we should seek someone that has the expertise in that area. And I call that common sense, but sometimes we don't think of those things. But if we seek someone else and we're in prayer, if we would get someone else's advice that is in that expertise, then that makes our decision a lot more successful and qualified. In chapter 2:17, it says that the king loved Esther more than any other women. She obtained grace and favor in his sight more than all the virgins. So he set the royal crown upon her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. While Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate, he learned of a plot of two of the king's eunuchs to lay hands on the king. Mordecai relayed this to Queen Esther, and when this information was confirmed to be true, both Bigthana and Teresh were hanged on a gallows. This was all written in the book of the Chronicles in the presence of the king. So remember this as an integral part of saving the Jewish nation. After this, the king Ahasuerus promoted Haman, and he was set above all the princes who were with him. So as commanded by the king, all of the king's servants were to bow down to Haman as they passed the king's gate. However, Mordecai did not bow down to Haman or pay homage to him, for he was a Jew, and he didn't take that practice. Well, this made Haman extremely furious. When Haman learned of the people of Mordecai being Jewish, he sought to destroy all the Jews who were throughout the whole kingdom of Ahasuerus. As Haman tells King Ahasuerus about all the different people living in his provinces and not obeying the king's laws, meaning the Jews, Haman shared with the king that it was not fitting for the king to let them, the Jews, remain. Chapter 3, verse 9, Haman is speaking. He says, "If it pleases the king, let a decree be written that they, meaning the Jews, be destroyed. And I will pay 10,000 talents of silver into the hands of those who do the work, to bring it into the king's treasuries." The king agreed. He gave his signet ring to Haman, and letters were sent out unto all the king's provinces to destroy, to kill, to annihilate all the Jews, and to plunder all their possessions. This decree was proclaimed in Shushan. When Mordecai learned of all this, he tore off all his clothes and put on sackcloth and ashes in mourning, and went as far as the front of the king's gate. Now this was taboo to do that, and so Esther sent clothes to Mordecai, but he refused to wear them. So then she sent a message with Hathach, who attended to Esther, and gave him a command concerning Mordecai, to learn what and why this was, that Mordecai was out there with sackcloth and ashes. So then Mordecai told Hathach all that had happened to him, and the sum of money that Haman had promised to pay to the king's treasuries to destroy all the Jews. He also gave him a copy of the written decree for their destruction, which was given at Shushan, that he might show it to Esther and explain it to her, and that she might go before the king to plead for her people, the Jews. So then Esther sent back a message for Mordecai, reminding him that nobody can go before the king unless called for by the king, because the consequence of doing that is death, unless he holds out his golden scepter to her. Mordecai's response to Esther in chapter 4, 13 and 14, "Do not think in your heart that you will escape in the king's palace any more than all the other Jews. For if you remain completely silent at this time, relief and deliverance will arise for the Jews from another place. But you and your father's house will perish. Yet, who knows whether you have come to the kingdom for such a time as this? So again, I have a note on a little lesson about here. Courage. It was taking courage for Esther to step out like this. So what do you need courage for in doing what the Lord is telling you to do? I'd say ponder about that a little bit. How do you attain spiritual help in facing this courageous act of obedience? Well, let's take Esther's example to fast and pray and include others to join you in the request. Then take courage to stand up as an advocate for what the godly cause is. As we see here, Esther's reply to Mordecai was calling for all the Jews in Shushan to fast for her, to neither eat nor drink for 3 days and 3 nights. Esther and her maids would do likewise. And then she said she would go before the king, which was against the law. But she said, if I perish, I perish. Esther went before the king, and she did have favor with him. The king asked what her request was, for he would give her anything, even half the kingdom. She said that if it pleased the king, she invited the king and Haman to a banquet that she would prepare for them. The king and Haman attended, and again the king asked Esther what was her request, that he would grant her anything, even half of his kingdom. She replied that if it pleased the king, she would prepare another banquet for the king and Haman, and she would tell him then. Haman left the banquet leaping with joy, carrying a little arrogance about himself and gloating that he was the only one invited to the second banquet along with the king. His wife, Zeresh, and all his friends said to Haman, let a gallows be made and suggest to the king that Mordecai be hanged on it, and then go merrily to the banquet. Remember that Mordecai never bowed to Haman, and therefore this idea pleased Haman, and so he had the gallows made. Another lesson. I think it's wise to be careful not to jump to conclusions or to allow pride to lead our ways. You may unexpectedly be faced with a standoff in humility, which I think Haman certainly did. Well, that night, the king could not sleep, so he commanded a servant to bring to him the book of the records of the Chronicles, and they were read to him. And it was found out that Mordecai had told of Bigthana and Teresh, 2 of the king's eunuchs, the doorkeepers, who had sought to lay hands on King Ahasuerus. The king asked, what honor or dignity has been bestowed on Mordecai for this? The servant answered, nothing has been done. Haman happened to be in the court, and the king said to the servant, let him come in. And the king asked Haman, well, what shall be done for the man whom the king delights to honor? So Haman, guess what? He is thinking it is him. It is himself to be honored. So he answered the king, and he said, "Let a royal robe which the king has worn, and a horse which the king has ridden, be handed to a noble prince, that he would parade this honored man on horseback through the city square." Well, guess what? The king took Haman's suggestion, and Haman had to be the one to lead Mordecai on horseback through the city square, proclaiming, "Thus shall it be done to the man whom the king delights to honor." Can you think of how Haman might have felt at that time? and, having to be put into that position? But that's what happens sometimes when you jump to conclusions, I guess. And so it makes you pause and think about, if you were put in that position, how might you handle it? Anyway, the king's eunuchs came and brought Haman to the banquet that Esther had prepared for him and the king. Queen Esther was again asked what her petition was, and the king would grant it. So then, chapter 7, verse 3 and 4, the queen answered and said, "If I have found favor in your sight, O king, and if it pleases the king, let my life be given me at my petition, and my people at my request. For we have been sold, my people and I, to be destroyed, to be killed, and to be annihilated. I would have held my tongue, although the enemy could never compensate for the king's loss." So King Ahasuerus asked, "Who might do this?" Esther's reply, "The adversary and enemy is this wicked Haman." Then the king arose in his wrath from the banquet of wine and went out to the palace garden. Haman was inside with Queen Esther, and he was pleading her for his life. And when the king returned, he found Haman had fallen across the couch where Esther was sitting. This further infuriated the king and ordered Haman to be hanged on the gallows that he had prepared for Mordecai. King Ahasuerus gave Queen Esther the house of Haman, and the king learned about how Esther and Mordecai were related as Jews. The king then gave Mordecai his signet ring, and Esther appointed Mordecai over the house of Haman. Chapter 8, verse 5. The Esther again went before the king, and he held out his golden scepter. And she said, "If it pleases the king, and if I have found favor in his sight, and the thing seems right to the king, and I am pleasing in his eyes, let it be written to revoke the letters devised by Haman, when she wrote to annihilate the Jews who were all in all the king's provinces." So the king agreed and told Esther and Mordecai that they could write their own decree and use the king's signet ring to send out the letters. By these letters, the king permitted the Jews who were in every city to gather together and protect their lives, to destroy, kill, and annihilate all the forces of any people or province that would assault them, and to plunder their possessions. Many of the people became Jews. The Jews gathered together to defend themselves, and so fear fell upon their adversaries, and thus the Jews defeated all their enemies. The king learned that the Jews had killed and destroyed 500 men in Shushan, the citadel, and also the 10 sons of Haman. The king asked Esther, what should be done about Haman's 10 sons? Chapter 9:13, Esther replied, let Haman's 10 sons be hanged on the gallows. The king ordered this to be done. The Jews did not lay a hand on any plunder where they were fighting. And so through this book of Esther, then we come to a celebration that's still celebrated today, the Feast of Purim. Mordecai had sent letters to all the Jews who were in the provinces of King Ahasuerus, suggesting that there should be an annual celebration of the Jews for their victory and rest from their enemies. For they had turned from mourning to celebrating a holiday, and that they should make them days of feasting and joy, of sending presents to one another, and gifts to the poor. The Jews accepted this custom, and so it is celebrated still today, every March 24th, and that's known as the Feast of Purim. So at the end here, I just want to let us consider 4 points as to what we may have learned from Esther. Number 1, as we look at Esther and how she portrayed herself, how she acted, how she responded, how she handled herself, and sought the Lord. Number 1, she extended, and we should, extend kindness, respect, and honor to others. 1 Peter 2:17 says, honor all people, love the brotherhood, fear God, honor the king. And number 2, seek wisdom and godly counsel before making decisions. Proverbs 2:6, for the Lord gives wisdom. From his mouth comes knowledge and understanding. Number 3, take courage in following the Lord toward his destiny for you, as Esther did. Be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid or terrified because of them, for the Lord your God goes with you, and he will never forsake you. And that was from Deuteronomy 31:6. Number 4, consider the consequences of stepping into pride. Proverbs 11:2, when pride comes, then comes disgrace, as we found in Haman's case. But with humility comes wisdom. So in conclusion, have you thought about the times that we are in? It's almost like we are kind of living through biblical times right now, today, and viewing and experiencing the evil times that we are living in. God needs many Esthers to pray and stand up in courage and team up with others to execute the plan of God for saving our nation, this great United States of America. So I'm asking, are you going to be, or are you now, an Esther to help our nation get back, get relieved of all of the agony, all of the sacrifices, all of the evil that has been going on in our nation? Are you going to be an Esther to stand up and do what you can to save our nation too. So, are you an Esther to help our nation and make America godly again?